All right, everybody. First, I want to thank everybody for helping with the Through the Lock training. So this is going to serve as our train the trainer. I figured it'd be really hard to get everybody together. So we're just going to go through, I'm going to send you a lesson plan as well as a PowerPoint presentation. This is just basically to get us all on the same page, make sure we're teaching the same thing. So when I send you the email, you're going to have the lesson plan. The first thing it's going to talk about is why we're going to do Through the Lock entry. It lists it in there, but essentially the idea is to gain entry in the situations that are not fires, like someone fell, they can't get up, or there's a pot on the stove, but it's not currently on fire, but we still need to make entry. So the idea is to do as little damage as possible. Another thing you'll go through is the terminology that's listed in there. And then after that, go through the different types of locks. So the PowerPoint presentation has a detailed description of each type of lock, what the mechanism is like, and where you would find those locks at. To aid you in that, you have the different types of locks that you can use as a prop. So the first type of lock to explain is a key and knob lock. So it's essentially just your doorknob lock. You've got your commercial version as well as your residential version. Your residential also may have a handle. So the idea behind it essentially is that you have what we call a spring latch. So it's beveled when the door closes and it goes into the keeper. It starts to depress and then goes inside the keeper. This little pin here is an anti-loiting pin. So when this is depressed, it doesn't allow the latch to be manipulated. And that's supposed to rest on the flat part of the keeper so it remains depressed. You have your two doorknobs that go in from either side, and there's a stem that goes through. When the doorknob is turned, the mechanism activates. So that's just kind of an explanation of the basic key and knob lock. So once again, beveled end goes, catches, the pin, if properly installed, is going to stay depressed. The next lock we're going to look at is a deadbolt. So the deadbolt is going to be found both commercial and residential once again. It's going to be located on either side of the door. The older deadbolts can have keyed on both sides. The newer ones are required to have the latching mechanism. So same as the key and knob lock, we have a stem going through that operates this mechanism here. When the key or the handle is turned on the inside, the mechanism operates and it opens and closes the bolt. The bolt then slides from the lock into a hole in the door frame and locks the door. I know most of this is common sense, we just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Then we have the mortise lock. So the mortise lock is essentially placed in a hole or a mortise cut in the side of a door. These are typically found in places like fire stations, commercial buildings, hospitals, schools. They can have multiple different types of latches, but the big thing is they all have this cylinder. So this cylinder here has threads, and that's how it's screwed into the locking mechanism itself. There's some grooves on the side here. Those grooves line up with some set screws that go in the side. So these tiny little set screws are the only thing holding this lock cylinder in. And we'll show you in a little bit why that's important and why that can help us get through these. So this is screwed all the way in. The set screws are put in place in one of the grooves. There's a couple different mechanisms. So this is kind of like our key and knob. It's a spring latch. This is an older style. The newer style have one little edge that flares out. But the same idea, if the pin is depressed, you can't activate the mechanism. We're going to take you over to this part of the station over here. Show you what a mortise lock looks like. It has a newer spring latch. So this is the newer type spring latch with one edge sticking out. Same deal. If the pin's depressed, it's not supposed to be able to be pushed in. Closes with the door, pin stays depressed, you can't manipulate the latch. This is your newer mortise style. As you can see, it has the cylinder and the handle all incorporated into one. The cylinder's almost flush, but not quite flush. The other style of mortise latch you have is found here. It's a pivoting deadbolt. So the idea is that this large deadbolt comes up into place. These are a lot of times found on storefront. Another version of this, instead of the solid deadbolt, has a hook. So these are going to be on your storefront glass doors. There is a little ball on the inside. If you depress it and push it forward, it opens the lock. Depress it, push it back, it locks it once again. Do that again. All right, we'll show you once again. Depress this little ball here, push it forward, and once again back, and allows you to manipulate the latch without damaging the lock. The other types of locks we may deal with are padlocks. Everyone knows what those are, and the various styles of those. We also may have your chain locks, your secondary locks found on doors in homes as an added security device. And the last type we have is what we call a rim lock. So rim lock is a surface mounted lock. Some examples of rim lock could be your panic bar, as we have over here, where the lock itself is mounted on the door. So this is the example of a rim lock because it's surface mounted. This is also another example of a rim lock. This is like a spring latch type ring lock where everything is mounted on the door, but serves as an extra security device. If you look on the outside, the rim lock cylinder is more flush than your mortise cylinder. And your rim lock up top here has a special code. So the best way to force these is conventional forcible entry. But on some of them, like this one, you may be able to pull off the entire face of the lock and manipulate the mechanism. So that's it for type of locks. In the next video, we'll talk about how to get through all those different locks. All right, through the lock, train the trainer, video 2. This is how to get through the different mechanisms and the progressions. Some of these are going to be used as props that you're going to teach in the training in November. So we're going to go through the same locks we went through when it came to what the locks were. So the first of those we're going to go through is the key and knob lock. So the goal of the key and knob lock is to get through it with as little manipulation as possible. Obviously, the first step is to try before you probably make sure it's actually locked. So assuming it's locked, what we're going to do is go through a couple different steps. So the idea is least damage to most damage. Most damage being the lock cylinder coming off, maybe a little surface damage to the door, but the door frame and door remain intact and usable. And just the lock itself will have to be replaced. So when we do a key and knob lock, our first option, if it's an outward swinging door, is to use a shove knife. So we've got a big bag of goodies. This is a through the lock bag. Goes along with the Rex tool. This will be on every truck. So something we have in here is called a shove knife. That's the wrong end of it. So on this shove knife, what essentially we're going to use is this little hook end right here. This is the same thing you'd be doing if you were using a knife to open this. People have done that in the past. So the idea with the shove knife is we're going to come in, we're going to grab, and we're going to slowly work the tip of the shove knife in while holding gentle pressure, pulling back on the door. And when we get the shove knife completely in front of the latch, while we're holding pressure, it should pop open. The caveat to this is this little pin, if it's properly installed, will be depressed. So there's a couple things we can do to relieve that. The first of which is we can push in on the door till we hear a click, and a lot of times that is enough to push the pin into the keeper. If not, we can take a wedge, a wooden wedge, so it doesn't mess up the door too bad, hit it in right below where we want to go, and that might open it enough to spread that pin, so we're not having an issue with manipulating the latch. So what we're going to do is we're going to come in, we're going to push it in, we're going to come at a slightly upward angle, and we're going to use this hook on the back side of the latch. And we're just going to work it back while pulling out, with the goal of opening the door using just a shove knife. Now, if you are to get through this and the deadbolt is also latched, we may have to go through the deadbolt through the lock as well. So that's step one for an outward swinging through the lock or key and knob lock. Assuming we can't do that or it's an inward swinging, the next thing we're going to do is use our Rex tool. So the Rex tool is like an updated version of the K tool. All it does is pull lock cylinders. So the idea is to slide the Rex tool over the lock. You have a mallet in here that you'll hammer down on this surface to put it into place, and then we're going to work this back and forth, up and down, until we pop off the knob. So with a key and knob lock, we'll start with the knob, and then we'll go for the entire lock itself. If you come over here, we have a commercial key and knob. We'll go ahead and show you the Rex tool on this. So like I said, we're going to start with the knob first. We weren't able to use our shove knife, so step two, Rex tool. So we're going to use our mallet to get it into place. And then we're going to start back and forth, nice and easy, and then up and down until it comes out. Now if you look inside, you'll see a stem sticking out. We have a pair of needle noses in the bag. You're just going to take the needle nose, grab the stem, and this will be the same for the doorknob locks, and we're going to manipulate the mechanism using the needle nose pliers. Now this one's been used a couple times, so it's a little boogered up, but it still works. So if you're doing a standard residential doorknob, it's going to be the same thing, manipulate the stem. If that doesn't work for some reason and you have to pull the entire surface of the lock off, what you're going to see is this little cam here, and we can take the end of our shove knife, stick it in, and just turn it and manipulate the latch. Then once we leave, we can leave this locked. We can dummy the lock cylinder face back on if possible, and leave the house semi-secured when we leave. So that is your options for a key and knob lock. The next one we're going to talk about is a deadbolt. So with a deadbolt, sometimes what you can do if you take a little bit of a longer screwdriver in your truck, your older deadbolts or your deadbolts that are pretty cheap on an outward swing door, you can sometimes do the same motion you would with the shove knife with a screwdriver and just kind of work that deadbolt back into its lock. But that's just for your really cheap or your older deadbolts. Also, if you have a tight space here, it's something you can't do. So our next option on the deadbolt is going to be to hit the top of it with the mallet. What we're trying to do here is create just enough space where we can manipulate the latch. So come here, we're just going to take it, we're going to smack it a couple times, try and get a little space. Once we have that space, what we'll see through the top of the space is our deadbolt, the top of the mechanism. So the idea here is we have some picks in the front. So we're going to take one of our picks, we're going to come through that little hole that we created, and we're going to use it to work the mechanism back through that little hole, and it should be able to operate the deadbolt that way. So you have a variety of different picks depending on the angle. So you have 4 different ones to choose from depending on what works best at that time. So that's option 2 for the deadbolt. Now option 3 is like our final option on everything, we can't do that. We're just going to use the Rex tool. So same thing, we're going to position our Rex tool over top of the cylinder. You can see that we have, this will be our fulcrum point. So we're going to position it here. We're going to hit it in place, work it back and forth, up and down, and we're going to pop the deadbolt off the door. Once we do that, once again, we can take our shove knife, stick our shove knife in here, and manipulate the mechanism to open the door. Once we leave, we can close the door again, dummy the lock cylinder on there, then they just have to replace the new lock. Couple of troubleshooting things. So if you find it's a door you feel is really going to be boogered up by using it as a fulcrum, you can get like a flat piece of metal or wood or something to stick behind it, just to kind of distribute that force a little bit more. The other thing we have in here is a set of 8-inch mini bolt cutters. So sometimes when you pull the deadbolt off, the 2 screws will stay in place. I had a loaner version of the Rex tool on the truck for a couple months, and I got to pull a few locks with it on real calls. So sometimes the screws will get stuck, and you don't want to keep wrenching on it to break the door. So you just come in here and cut those 2 screws, and then manipulate your mechanism. So that's your deadbolt. So now we're going to move on to the mortise cylinders. So we have the 3 different types of latches on mortise cylinders. We know we have the deadbolt and also the deadbolt with the hook, as well as the slam latch. So we'll go over this one first. So remember, we talked about this groove here is lined up with set screws. These small set screws are what hold this in place. So anytime that we have a mortise cylinder, our first option on the mortise cylinder should be to use our locking pliers, and you can preset these if you'd like. So what we're going to do here is just lock them on the surface of the lock, and you may just have to lock them on the rim depending on how much is available to you. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back and forth a couple times. What that's going to do is break those set screws and then allow us just to spin the entire cylinder out. Once the cylinder's out, on the Rex tool itself, there's a type of key tool meant for these types of locks. It's essentially like a square Allen wrench. We're going to come in here, we're going to press down that ball and press forward on it. It's going to open the lock. We're going to go inside, do our business. When we leave, we can put it back into place, dummy the cylinder on there, and then all they'll have to replace is that lock cylinder instead of everything. If that doesn't work, our next step, once again, is to use the Rex tool. Reasons this may not work is you might have a protective collar made of steel or some other hard metal that doesn't allow you to crimp down on it. Also, it might be extra flush with the door or with the handle assembly that you just can't grab with those locking pliers. So, to demonstrate our Rex tool to everyone, we have this lock pulling prop here. So what this is, they're just drilled out cylinders. You come here, you place the cylinder in, line up the holes, and we'll have some dowels available to you guys to place through the locking mechanism. We're going to use this bottom one because we have an arrow and a mark. I'll make sure they all have that. Once the all right, well, there we go. All right, so once the dowel's in there, we break this out. How you reset it is you just get the remaining bits of the broken dowel out and push the dowel in further. What that's going to do is just provide some resistance on this lock pulling tool. So our next option, because we can't spin out the cylinder, is to use the Rex tool. Once again, we're going to place this behind the cylinder. We're going to get our mallet, And this should provide some good resistance, kind of get a little bit of a feel of what it would be like. So we're going to come here, get a few good wraps, and we're going to go back and forth. Up, down, back, forth. Our lock cylinder's out. We're going to manipulate it just like we would, just like we showed you. So this lock pulling prop and this door prop are going to be available to you to demonstrate these. I will make sure we have plenty of wooden dowels. Make sure we have everything marked for you when the time comes. Another thing we're going to show you now is the spring latch version of this. So remember, this is the older spring latch version. We're going to show you on this and on the newer. So there are two options available to you before you pull a cylinder. So the first is to try and use a shove knife the same way. Just kind of work it back into place, just as you would the key and knob lock. Remember, we want to come up kind of at this angle and kind of work it back. The other option we have is a modified framing square, and the idea behind this is we're just going to push it in until it depresses the latch. This is really good when there is a protective plate over top of the lock preventing you a latch plate. So we're going to go over to two actual doors and show you these techniques on the actual doors and show you also how to overcome them if you need to. So once again, here we are. This is our newer version. We have this one bevel then. If you're able to get your shove knife back here and depress this middle piece, it pulls the whole thing in. So we're just going to come with our shove knife, try and work it in there, and have backwards pressure on the door as you're doing it. This door, the pin obviously doesn't work on it, but if the pin did work and it wasn't allowing us with not a big enough gap to be able to do it, something we can do is just take our wedge, shove it in there, hit a little gap, and then manipulate it. Another thing we can do is to use our modified framing square. It's a lot simpler, a lot easier. All of the bags don't have these yet, but they will very soon. All right, so once again, this one has your spring latch type of mortise lock. This one has a latch guard. So all we're doing with this is coming down and pulling back while holding pressure on the door. Come in, pull back, and we're in. Now, if there's a secondary device like a deadbolt and it's activated, makes it a little more difficult, but a lot of schools and a lot of places have these types of locks, and that's the only lock that's on it. All right, so the last few of the auxiliary locks we're going to talk about, just some other tips and tricks to get through these types of locks. So this one actually came from Lieutenant Craig Edison. He showed me this one. But if we have a padlock and we don't want to damage it, or we want to do limited damage to it, something we can do is take a piece of webbing. This is actually an 8-foot piece of webbing, including in through the lock kit. You're going to pull downward pressure. You're going to hit a couple times on the lock itself, on the side of the body. The lock comes undone. The lock is still functioning. Still works normal. They can go back to business. We're in and out. If for some reason the webbing and mallet trick doesn't work, some other tips to get through a padlock. So you can take your Halligan forks, you can stick them over top. This works especially well if it's on a chain, and just twist the Halligan bar itself. It'll do the same kind of force and pull the lock apart and open it. Another thing you can do, for some reason, if that doesn't work, maybe you don't have the space to spin the Halligan, take the fork, stick it over, hit the top side of the forks, and it should pop off. So those are padlocks. Now we're going to show you chain locks. So the idea with this is we've either had these open and the chain lock is activated, or we've had to get through these locks and we still find this chain lock here. Now remember, all this is not in a fire type situation. This is a lesser acute situation. So we've made this gap a little wide for purposes of demonstration. But the idea is we have this chain lock here. We're going to take a piece of webbing. We're going to bring it over top of the door and lay it flat. We're going to make sure the chain isn't on top of the door. And as we close the door, we're going to work this chain to the left. So we're going to show you that one more time from the chain lock side. So, and on a real door, you may have a little bit tighter gap at the top, so it may take a little bit more effort, a little bit more practice, but the idea is get it here, close the door, and as we close it, shimmy it over, pull it open. There's your chain lock. One more thing I want to talk about, one more type of lock, is your different style of panic bar. So we showed you the panic bar earlier. This is a flat bar. When you have the bar that comes out and goes across, I've seen these on different types of churches, some schools and stuff. A lot of times what you can do with those, because they lock at top and bottom, is you can go between them, assuming they don't have a center post. So if there's no center post and there's just clean air, you can go between the two of them. You can grab your lockout kit from your truck. You can use the long rod type thing and bend it into like a J shape. Stick it through, grab the panic bar, pull it down, and it should activate the door. So that's just a bunch of different through the lock stuff. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Thanks again for helping.